Thanks so much. Hi, everybody. I will speak for a bit and then I'll turn it over to Sarah. And I just want to, before I share my PowerPoint and can't see you anymore, while I do that, just wanted to greet everybody. The last time I spoke to City Congregation was July of last year when the pandemic was new and unknown. Now it's old and unknown, and I genuinely cannot wait until the next time I present to City Congregation and be able to do it in person, because this is getting tired. But this particular presentation won't be tired at all. It will be very exciting. So let me share my screen with you all, and you'll let me know if you can see that. I can't even see anybody's face to see if you're nodding that you can see it. Can you see it? Peter, nod if you can see it. I could see you, Peter. Okay.
You can see it.
Great. Today we're going to talk about Jews for a Secular Democracy, providing a Jewish perspective on the separation of church and state. So the mission reads, to counter the influence of religion on government policy, Jews for Secular Democracy is an initiative galvanizing the Jewish community to defend the separation of church and state. This is a pluralistic initiative. So the Society for Humanistic Judaism is a movement that is not pluralistic. We have a particularist take on the Jewish identity, the Jewish experience. It is a denomination of Judaism that I would argue makes a Jewish event more pluralistic when we're included. I think one of the nice things about having our own pluralistic initiative is that we can guarantee that our events, our programs will be genuinely pluralistic in that they will include the Jewish religious spectrum as well as secular Jews. I've been a Jewish communal professional for many, many years. I've been to many Jewish communal events that claim to be pluralistic, and in their mind, pluralistic ranges from Orthodox to Reform. We can provide a genuinely pluralistic approach to our issues. And we're bringing to the advocacy and education that we do the full Jewish experience, the Jewish religious, but also the Jewish cultural and historic experience to counter religious fundamentalism. One thing I really wanted to kind of focus on tonight is why this is an initiative of Humanistic Judaism and why I would love to see the City Congregation deeply involved in this work. We do have a number of folks, some of them are here with us tonight, who have been very generous in their support and involvement with Jews for Secular Democracy, and we'd love to see the City Congregation take a leadership role as well. I feel like in looking at what our movement does and who is involved in our movement and what it stands for, the commonality that we have as humanistic Jews is in the belief of separation of church and state. Perhaps more unanimously than on any other issue are the issues that tie into church-state separation, which include women's equality, reproductive rights, and LGBTQ equality. And the reason why we launched this is because while there are great secular organizations working on church-state separation, and these are a few of them, Americans United for Separation of Church and State, Freedom from Religion Foundation, and the Secular Coalition for America, which Society for Humanistic Judaism is one of the founding members of, brings these and other organizations together around church-state separation. American Atheists is another, Center for Inquiry is another great one. They cannot come at it with the Jewish perspective. And that's something that we can provide that these organizations can't. That's a unique opportunity for us. And likewise, within the Jewish community, there are great organizations working on the specific issues, but they're mostly not bringing a church-state separation lens to their work. I have very rarely, and I follow Keshet, and I follow National Council of Jewish Women. Hazon is a Jewish environmental group. Very rarely have I seen them object to government policy based on the First Amendment, which we're going to talk about in a moment. A lot of these organizations come together at the Jewish Social Justice Roundtable. The Society for Humanistic Judaism is now a member of that organization as well, thanks to the work that we're doing for Jews for a Secular Democracy. But the reason why I felt this was such a great opportunity for us, even though it zeroes in on a particular angle, is because this is the thing that we as humanistic Jews can bring to the table that nobody else is doing, right? One of the really most amazing days in my professional career as executive director at SHJ was when I joined City Congregation for the Women's March. I think many of you did that as well, and City Congregation had a great contingent, and it was a powerful day. And I think that march did make a difference in the overall story and overall movement toward greater equality for women. But humanistic Judaism is never going to be better at advocating for women's equality than the National Council of Jewish Women, because they do a great job, and we don't need to reinvent their wheel, and we don't want to compete with them because they're great. In fact, you can support them. I encourage you to support them. I support all of the organizations that are up on this screen. It's not a zero-sum game. But what they're not doing is bringing, first of all, mostly a secular Jewish voice to the table, but also a focus on separation of church and state as the thing that they want to hammer away on. So I really feel like there's an opportunity there. I know that it may not, that many of the issues do tie into church-state separation. Some of them do not, and we can talk about that in the Q&A about, what are your issues that you're most passionate about and whether or not they tie into it. But as a movement and also as an affiliated community of our movement, I really feel like this is an opportunity for us to have a louder voice certainly in the Jewish community and in the wider social justice community around a specific issue. So what's the issue? The issue is that by law, we are protected from religion, from our government establishing and privileging one religion over another. So this is the First Amendment of the US Constitution. The first phrase in it, that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, is referred to as the Establishment Clause, and it is coupled with the next part of that phrase, which is the Free Exercise Clause, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, right? So this is like the two sides of the coin, and in this very short sentence have been countless legal cases trying to figure out exactly where that border is between hands-off religion, the first part, and allowing religious people the freedom that they think they're entitled to practice their religion. And that's the tension in the First Amendment that so many issues are battled over. So, hypothetical question, but take a moment in your own mind to look at this image and answer for yourself. Is this a secular symbol? Would you say that this symbol does not represent a particular religion? The answer is no. Clearly, it's a cross, it's a Christian cross. And you should also know that this Christian cross is maintained thanks to taxpayer dollars. So to me, that is exactly what the First Amendment is supposed to be protecting against. I don't want my money, my tax money, I don't want my tax money going to a lot of things. But the First Amendment says that my tax money shouldn't go to support a religious symbol like this. And yet, recently, the Supreme Court ruled that tax dollars can go to support the Bladensburg Peace Cross Memorial, even though they acknowledge that it's a Christian symbol because they say it has taken on an additional meaning. So this is very frustrating, right? And this, on the one hand, can feel outrageous. And on the other hand, so what? It's a big stone slab. Our government wastes so much of our tax money. What's a few more dollars to maintain this stupid cross, right? It's like, it's a little thing compared to the grand scheme of things. So why was this so devastating a decision to so many people? Because when you have the big picture of what's going on, which I hope to share with you, you can see how what's really happening is a chipping away of all of our rights. Another example of this chipping away are these harmless "In God We Trust" bills. So many of you may know that the national motto was changed to "In God We Trust" very recently, in some of our lifetimes, 1956. A lot of people don't know this. At least one of our elected officials who we had do a webinar for us a while back thought that this was the motto since the founding of the country. And many people do. It's on our money, and so people should know that, first of all, no, this was part of the Cold War legacy. And because it's the national motto, it has opened a floodgate of opportunity for Christian nationalists to put this phrase in as many places as they possibly can, in public schools, for example, or on driver's licenses. There's now a lawsuit about a state that has it on all of their driver's licenses, and there's no option to have a license without it. So I'm hoping that that lawsuit will be successful, and they'll at least give the option to not have "In God We Trust" on your license plate if you live in that state. Again, is this killing people? Maybe not. Is this chipping away at rights toward a bigger goal? I'll show you that we think it is, because it is a strategy put in place by a Christian fundamentalist group or several groups that have created this thing that they call Project Blitz, which, the word blitz should immediately terrify Jews in general, but they, I don't think they thought it was going to even be public that that's what they were calling it. It was a collaboration between the Congressional Prayer Caucus Foundation, the National League Foundation, and a group called Wall Builders. These are Christian nationalist groups who created a playbook for local legislation to start building a ladder toward Christian supremacy in our country. So, "In God We Trust" put it in as many places as we can. They know that the Supreme Court has ruled on this already. It is our national motto, and therefore they're going to get these bills passed. We are also, Jews for Secular Democracy is a partner in this coalition called Blitz Watch, which exposes this initiative by Christian nationalists to track these bills and try to counter them and try to stop them from, for example, using the phrase Judeo-Christian values to justify this agenda, when overwhelmingly Jews stand against these laws that they're passing. So here's where they're ultimately working toward. Who can adopt a child in America? Can you adopt a child if you're gay or lesbian, if you're Jewish, if you're Catholic? This is an article from the Forward from a couple of years back. There is an adoption agency in South Carolina run by a Protestant denomination that will not adopt kids out to LGBTQ or Jews. So overall, the war today is really on LGBTQ, but in this case, Jews as well. And so there's a current lawsuit, Madonna versus U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, because the issue is this agency still gets federal funds. And again, it's our tax dollars. It's a direct violation of the First Amendment, and they've gotten exclusions to keep discriminating. This is tax-funded discrimination, and the taxpayers have no say in this. In a case that just was just decided by the Supreme Court a few months ago is the one at the bottom here, Fulton versus City of Philadelphia, where it was a similar case in that the City of Philadelphia realized that the Archdiocese, the Catholic Social Services of Philadelphia, would not adopt out to gay and lesbian potential adoptive parents. And the City of Philadelphia said, okay, well, that's a breach of our rules and we're not going to contract with you anymore. And the Archdiocese sued and won. The Supreme Court decided in favor of the discrimination. Now, the ruling was what's called a narrow defeat. And full disclosure, I'm not a lawyer. I come at this from a lay perspective and as an advocate. My understanding is we can't take this as a major setback. It's, again, an example of just the little chipping away. And what's going to happen is the result is cities like Philadelphia all over the country now are going to have to look at the wording of their codes and regulations to determine, first of all, how can they prevent tax-funded discrimination, but secondly, how can they prevent it in a way that isn't now going to get overturned in court, because the claim will be that this is preventing religious people from exercising their religion, right? Their religion tells them that LGBTQ people should not adopt. And this is where we are today. There are, and the battle is really now on the state level in terms of, in this case, discrimination in adoption and foster care. These are some of the states that have the same kind of discriminatory laws. But ultimately, the Supreme Court is not going to save us, is part of the challenge, because over the past couple of decades, they have moved right on all of these issues. And I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on these, but if you never heard of them before, just as a brief summary, Religious Freedom Restoration Act, or RFRA, 1993, it passed, I believe, unanimously or almost unanimously in Congress, because it was a very good law in terms of protecting the religious practice of individuals to, I believe the original case that the law was trying to, frankly, counter was someone, I believe, going to jail for using peyote for religious purposes. And what happened is that law got completely distorted and overtaken by religious fundamentalists. And the key cases that you may have heard of, Hobby Lobby, I hope some of you have heard of this case, in which the Supreme Court basically said that a corporation can have a religious viewpoint. And this corporation's religious viewpoint says women shouldn't use contraceptive. We are not going to pay for the pill because it's against our religion as a corporation. And the Supreme Court said yes. And more recently is the Masterpiece Cake Shop, which you may also have heard of, where a baker refused to bake a cake for a gay couple. And again, what happened was the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which was intended to protect the individual to practice their religion, got really twisted to allow the dominant religion to discriminate based on their own religious beliefs. So what we're trying to do, Jews for Secular Democracy, is challenge, first of all, the narrative. We reject their notions of family values. Like, for example, when life begins, Jews have never believed that life begins at conception. Roe v. Wade cites Jewish religious belief along with others when they made abortion legal by saying, if we litigate on this, then we're picking sides, which is what we're not allowed to do. We're picking one religion over another. That was the correct decision that we are now very close to having, again, chipped away to such a degree that abortion is soon to become, I believe, illegal in a number of states. We want to, as mentioned, denounce this appropriation of our name. You know, the phrase Judeo-Christian is used repeatedly by Christian fundamentalists to make it seem like they're being inclusive. And sadly, a lot of folks hear that phrase, a lot of Jewish people think, hey, we're included, we're in. But first of all, we're not, because their values are not ours. But secondly, even if we were in, Jewish and Christian is not the only religions being practiced in America. It's still an exclusionary phrase. And we also want to leverage the Jewish experience, the history, to stand up for others as well. And we want to push back against their policy agenda, this license to discriminate that they've been pushing through the courts. Immigration and refugee rights touches on freedom of religion in some ways. It got blatant under the Trump administration with a so-called Muslim ban that quickly got renamed, but there's a degree there. They have pushed back on gains made for women's rights, reproductive rights, LGBTQ equality, and secular education is something that's actually very relevant to us here in New York that we'll talk about in a bit. The Jewish communal perspective is so valuable and has been with us since we came to this country. There's a famous letter that George Washington wrote to the Jews of Newport, Rhode Island. I hope you're aware of it. I won't read it all to you. I'm quoting a big chunk of it here, but I'll just read the part in red. The government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens. You know, first of all, it's beautiful. This is a famous quote, and it is basically clearly saying, doesn't matter what your religion is, be a good citizen and you're equal. But we know that has not been the Jewish experience. So one example is the Immigration Act of 1924, which is also called the Johnson-Reed Act or the National Origins Act. It wasn't just against Jews, but it really impacted the Jewish experience. It was also anti-Catholic. And it was quotas about who can come into this country. And it was happening at a time when Jews needed it the most. Jews were not able to come to this country during World War II to flee Hitler. And there were other restrictions that were either written into laws or not protected through laws, such as Jews being restricted to not be able to go to certain hotels, clubs. There were college quotas. Jews couldn't live in certain neighborhoods. And all of this history needs to inform our social justice today. For the most part, we're not seeing that discrimination. You know, that the adoption agency headline that I had up there aside, for the most part, Jews today in America are in a position where we can advocate on behalf of others who are now being discriminated against. And we need to do that because there's no other mitzvah repeated more often in the Torah than you shall love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. This is about empathy. And that's ultimately where social justice springs from. So I am now going to turn it over to Sarah to talk a little bit more about the specifics here in New York.
Great, thanks, Paul, and really glad to be here. Thank you so much for hosting us. Before I get into what we're working on in New York, I want to start with the backdrop of January 6th, because it really ties together what Paul was talking about earlier with, you know, what's the big picture? What are all these, between the Bladensburg Cross, the Supreme Court decisions, the kinds of bills we're seeing as a result of Project Blitz, what is the bigger picture agenda that's being chipped away towards slowly? And the key thing to understand is the rise of Christian nationalism. And there's probably no better display of what that means and how dangerous it is than what happened in January 6th. Because as you can see from the pictures here, and I'm also going to drop a few links in the chat here where you can do some further reading on the presence of Christian nationalism on January 6th. I have analysis here from the New York Times as well as Time Magazine. And that first link is actually a website called Christians Against Christian Nationalism, which is exactly what it sounds like, because this has become such a huge issue that we have allies in the Christian community who are standing up and calling out Christian nationalism and organizing to counter it. So really, in a nutshell, Christian nationalism is kind of and really you should understand it as white Christian nationalism, because there is an ethnocentric aspect of it where to be an American, generally, a white Christian American, that those two identities of being an American, being a white Christian are merged together. And so, it's an intersection of white supremacy as well as sort of this Christian religious nationalism. We saw on January 6th, we saw Jesus Save signs. We saw people when they broke into the Capitol praying at the dais in the Senate. You have lots of people with their Bibles, with the Christian flag was flown right next to the Confederate flag in the halls of Congress as they broke in. This is not just happenstance. This is really part and parcel of the kind of movement we saw there. So this was a lot of Christian nationalist leaders were a big part of the Stop the Steal messaging that led up to this. And so I have a few more pictures here that Paul will click through. This is when they were praying on the dais. And if I can pull this up really quickly, I think I have the actual, what they said at that prayer in front of me. Just a second here, because I think it really does demonstrate what exactly their beliefs are and what makes Christian nationalism so particularly unique and so dangerous. Let's see, I think I have it here, just bear with me. So the prayer that you're seeing in that picture, they said, quote, "Thank you for allowing the United States of America to be reborn. Thank you for allowing us to get rid of the communists, the globalists, and the traitors within our government. We love you and we thank you. In Christ's holy name, we pray, amen." That was what was said in the People's House after these people beat up police officers on the front lines carrying their Christian flags and all of that. I think it's really important to note that this is not just some crazy fringe thing, right? There's a lot of Americans who subscribe to the belief that the United States is a Christian nation. And polling as recently as 2020 showed that 25% of Americans polled by the Public Religion Research Institute said that they would prefer that the nation be mostly Christian. And that we have 36% of the country saying that we are a Christian nation. So while it's not a majority, that is not a small amount of people. And so it's not something that we can just dismiss as, it's these crazy people over here. And this is something that the secular community has been trying to raise awareness about for years. January 6th was really the culmination of that movement building up, and we saw firsthand how dangerous and formidable it really is. So moving on to, this is just another picture, go ahead. So what can we do about it? We really, as Paul talked about earlier, you all have a really unique opportunity to make the Jewish voice heard in this space, because we really have a unique perspective on these issues. We can really add value to the broader movement that's advocating for separation of church and state. And part of that is raising awareness among the Jewish community about Christian nationalism. So we have 3 cohorts that we're building in Florida, Michigan, and New York. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Florida now, just to give you an example of the kinds of things that we can do to make a difference. And then I'll talk about New York and some very specific things we're working on now. And hopefully we can convince some of you to join us in. So one of the things we're doing in Florida is we have a traveling panel where myself, our lead volunteer, Rick Gold, who's our lead volunteer for Florida Jews for Secular Democracy. We have Rabbi Meryl Shapiro, And we have Reverend James Coffin, who is a Seventh-day Adventist and is one of the signers of the Christians Against Christian Nationalism statement, which has been signed by hundreds, I think at this point, thousands of Christian clergy across the country. And we have visited several Jewish congregations virtually and continue to do so, just to have the conversation about Christian nationalism. What is it? Why is it dangerous? What is it that they believe? And how can the Jewish community get involved? Because the first step, of course, at addressing any sort of big problem is to recognize it as a problem. And only recently, after January 6th, because this is something I follow very closely, mainstream media wasn't really even using the phrase Christian nationalism. I have a Google alert that every time it's Christian nationalism is mentioned in the news, it comes up. And of course, it finally in mainstream media was showing up more after January 6th. And so that's a good thing. There's more awareness, but there's still a lack of understanding about what Christian nationalism has to do with this big picture, right? So the legal advocacy work that they've done over decades to get the kinds of decisions in their favor that Paul was discussing earlier, the Project Blitz, where they've have the resources and the organization to get these bills passed. And one thing I want to add to that Project Blitz conversation is the In God We Trust bills that Paul mentioned. That's stage one. That's kind of like the easy, low-hanging fruit round of bills. The ultimate goal for Project Blitz is their stage 3 bills, where they want to have the broadest possible religious exemptions from laws that apply to everybody else. Which is kind of what, along the lines of what happened with Hobby Lobby, right? Employers were required by the Affordable Care Act to provide insurance plans to their employees that include birth control, free birth control. And what Christian nationalists and their organizations want is, if any law does not, sit well with their, biblical views, they want to weaponize religious liberty to get out of those laws, even if it adversely impacts other people. In the case of Hobby Lobby employees, right? When you apply for a job at Hobby Lobby, which is a craft store, I doubt most people are thinking, gosh, I should really inquire about the religious views of the CEO of this massive company to see if maybe birth control will be included in my health insurance plan, right? You as an employee have religious beliefs, and you have the freedom from religious beliefs, unfortunately, no more. Right? Hobby Lobby basically said that the employees' religious beliefs can then be imposed on employees, and it's beyond employers. What they want is, they want to be, as businesses, nonprofits, as individuals, they just want religious freedom to be a sort of get out of jail free for any law that they don't want, that they don't like. And of course, they very usually are most often trying to target the LGBT community. They want to be able to discriminate, have a license to discriminate without any repercussions. But we know that once you use religious liberty as an argument to get out of non-discrimination laws, you can use it to discriminate against anyone for any reason, whether that's single mothers or interfaith couples, Jews, atheists, because once you say that, as long as it's a religious belief, you don't have to do it, then those beliefs can't be questioned. And we know, by the way, that these same religious freedom arguments were used decades ago to justify racial segregation. Bob Jones University had a policy on their campus that forbade students from interracial dating, and they luckily, back then, at least the courts made the right decision. They lost their nonprofit status as a university. At the time, when they were suing to get their nonprofit status back, they were using the same religious liberty arguments that we're hearing today. So we know that once you allow religious freedom to be used to discriminate, it's dangerous to everybody. And another thing, and I really want to underscore this because Paul mentioned it earlier, it's not just that they want a license to discriminate and the get out of jail free card. They want that plus access to your taxpayer dollars. So they want to be able to do business with the government, whether it's for social services, like in the Fulton case, or, as a business, contractor for the government. They want to be able to have access to funding and to also be able to not play by the same rules as everybody else. And they've actually flipped the script with the word discrimination, where they say that if the government says that, we have these two contractors, one's faith-based, one is not, and this one will discriminate on the basis of religion and this one will not, that if the government makes a distinction in deciding whom they're going to contract with, that is discrimination, that is discrimination, right? So they're very, very smart in their messaging here, and we have to be aware of it. So that's one of the things we're doing in Florida, because a lot of this is just unknown to folks, or they've maybe heard bits and pieces, but they're not really seeing the big picture agenda and how it's tied to the kinds of messaging that we're seeing, whether it be around things like Judeo-Christian values. A lot of times we see, for example, the leading up to January 6th, there was the Jericho March, if you had heard of that, as part of the Stop the Steal thing. And I noticed that on their website and in some of their social media materials, they used the word Judeo-Christian a number of times, and they had a picture of a cross next to a Jewish star. So, really, we need to be calling this out, and saying, don't use our community, as a pawn in this agenda that is really not beneficial to anybody but, Christians who subscribe to their particular worldview. So one of the ways that we're taking action in Florida is just having that conversation. And so just to close the loop on that, that's one thing that you can do just as an action, is to have a conversation with your friends and family, with your community about Christian nationalism. What is it? How is it connected to the kinds of things that you're seeing happening that concerns you? And through this work that we're doing in Florida, we're really building a network of people who can join us in fighting the kinds of things we see in Florida all the time. Lots of bad bills happening in the legislature, lots of Christian nationalist rhetoric among politicians there. We discovered that there really isn't an existing network of Jewish leaders in Florida who can speak with one voice on this issue. We are building that network by visiting these congregations, talking to the rabbis, talking to their members, getting them aware, and then we're hoping over the next 6 months to a year, after having visited enough folks, we'll be able to really mobilize all the people that we've reached through having this conversation to actually take action. So speaking of action, we are doing a few really exciting things in New York. So I think, before I start talking about this bill, I think there's this general idea, especially if you live in New York City, that, we don't have church-state separation issues. We live in this liberal, progressive state, so, there's no urgency. That's really not the case. First of all, there's not a single state, whether it's California or Oregon or New York, that has a perfect secular record. And a great resource to check that out and see for yourself is American Atheist has a scorecard for each state. And, there are states where, blue states that still allow for child marriage. Many states still have exemptions on the books for child abuse and neglect that are based on religion, right? So whether that's faith healing or, exemptions from criminal negligence of a child if it's based on a religious reason. So you might be surprised the kinds of laws that are on the books. But in addition to that, it's not just that there's room for, no state is perfect. In a state where you have a friendly legislature around these issues, there are ways we can be proactive. And we can really have some wins, because I can tell you it's really, really hard in a place like Florida to keep people motivated, because the urgency is there, but it's such an uphill battle. In a place like New York, we have fantastic opportunities to make a difference in real time. So one of the bills we're working on, I'm sure some of you have heard of a great organization called YAFED, which is really calling out the fact that 60,000 students in New York are deprived of a basic education, basic math, basic English, basic history. The founder of YAFED, Naftuli Moser, tells his story, and it's incredible. I mean, he graduated from his yeshiva, and he didn't even know what an essay was, right? Some of these students are graduating, they don't speak English, and they're completely unequipped to enter the workforce. And it's a way to keep them really in the community, because it's so difficult to leave if you're basically illiterate, can't do basic math and all those things. And so basically what's happened is that because the ultra-Orthodox community is just such a strong voting bloc, politicians in New York have kind of just turned a blind eye to this issue for a really long time. And, you know, the last thing they want to do is upset them, and especially be, you know, accused of being, you know, anti in any sort of way, which means that having a Jewish voice that's advocating for the rights of these students to have a basic secular education is really, really needed. We can bring a really credible voice to that discussion. And so there is a bill that we are supporting called the Right to Learn Act. So the number here is the A is for the Assembly and the S is for the Senate. So they're identical bills introduced in both chambers. And our volunteers are writing to their legislators, encouraging them to co-sponsor these bills. We just, one of our volunteers just got confirmation that his assembly member will be co-sponsoring because he did that outreach. That was just last week. So this is really having an impact. Just so you know what this bill does, it eliminates a provision that allows a different and inferior standard of education for non-public schools in New York. And it would basically, and just to actually back up for a second, these schools that are not providing an adequate secular education are already violating the law. It's not like it's legal for them to do this. It's just that they've been getting away with it, and there's not enough teeth in the law to make sure that they actually comply. And again, politicians have really been avoiding taking action and enforcing the law. So the Right to Learn Act adds a lot of teeth to the law that already exists. And one of the ways it does that is it require non-public schools, including ultra-Orthodox yeshivas, to certify to the Commissioner of Education that they're providing a substantially equivalent education. And if they make any false certification in that process, this is if this bill is passed, they have to return the state funds that they were given, right? And that's our taxpayer dollars. They have to return those funds for the time period that they were falsifying their certification. And then they're ineligible to receive any state funds for 5 years. That's a really, really strong provision, right? Because right now, not only are they violating the law, but they're still receiving taxpayer funding while depriving 60,000 students in New York of a basic education. There's a few other things in this bill. Those are probably the top highlights. I'm happy to answer more questions about them. Before I move on to the next bill, there's another aspect to this that's related, which is there's the bill and then there's regulations through the Department of Education. Basically, what's been happening is through bureaucratic tactics, the Department of Education has been dragging its feet on issuing new regulations. There were regulations that were put out, I think, a few years ago that were really strong, but they basically were never implemented, and they kind of just started the process over again. So the current draft regulations, they expired on July 31st, and they're going to propose a new set of regulations this fall. And then there's going to be a whole rulemaking process after, and a public comment period, which will be an opportunity for our folks and for all of you to participate. And then the voting on the new regulations are going to be next year in, late winter this year or spring of next year. And so what's important to note about this is that by reaching out to your legislators, you can ask them also to voice their support for strong regulations by having them pick up the phone and call the commissioner of the New York State Education Department and call the chancellor of the New York State Board of Regents, which is responsible for drafting the rules. And the big ask here, and I know this is a little bit in the weeds, but it's important to know that all of these bureaucratic tactics it's really important for everyday people, New York constituents, to be active in talking to their legislators about this, because they have been dragging their feet on this for a while. And the risk, if we're not heard on these regulations, is that the new set of regulations might be much weaker than the last round. It's, for example, we want to make sure that they don't say that providing Judaic studies is kind of enough to say is substantially providing critical thinking skills, right? So we want to make sure that they're actually mandating specific areas of study being taught. So real math, real science, English, and history instruction. We want to make sure that they don't use this kind of vague language to kind of create loopholes to just say, well, we provide Judaic studies and that satisfies the critical thinking skills that are required of public schools in New York, right? We want to make sure the regulations are really, really strong and take into account the deep disregard for secular studies among the ultra-Orthodox yeshivas and make sure that it's enforceable. So we're working really closely with Yafet on this. Right now, like I mentioned, our volunteers are writing letters to their legislators. We're also setting up meetings. This is really something I think that's really fun to do. If you've never done it before, a lot of folks think this is intimidating, but it's really empowering to have a virtual meeting or an actual meeting back in the day before COVID with your elected official or their staff. Really, the thing to remember is your representatives, your elected representatives, they work for you. You pay their salaries with their taxpayer dollars. And one of the most impactful things that you can do for an organization like Yafed, for Jews for a Secular Democracy, is to have a relationship with that office. Really, they should be hearing from you a few times a year. You should know who the staff are, because if you care about these issues, I can guarantee you so few people actually do this, have a meeting, reach out to these offices, that the people who do really have an outsized impact. And that's where your actions are so important, because you can bet that the folks who are not interested in being held accountable, these yeshivas who want to get access to taxpayer dollars from New Yorkers and be able to get away with not teaching their students basic math, basic English, they are having these kinds of meetings. They are organized. They are really good at whipping up a lot of pressure. And so it's really important that we counter that by having our constituents who are behind us on the fact that, yes, every student in New York should have access to a basic secular education. They need to hear from you. And we can provide that support. So if you're interested in supporting the Right to Learn Act, I'm going to put my email in the chat. You can email me, and all I need to know is who your assembly member is, who your senator is, and if you want to have a virtual meeting or send an email to that office, I will help you. I will train you, provide you the talking points. You don't have to have ever done this before. A lot of volunteers that we're working with have never done this before, but it makes a really huge impact, and it actually doesn't really take a lot of time. And then, Paul, if you can go to the next slide. The other bill that we're having folks work on is a bill that will ensure that anytime someone is in the New York court system and they are mandated to attend a addiction recovery program, that they are provided with a secular option. So just a little bit of background on this. If you're in the court system looking at your a reduced sentence, or if you were arrested for a DUI, or you're incarcerated and you're facing options for parole, there's a lot of different points in the criminal justice system. If you are have committed a drug-related crime, where the state will mandate you to attend a recovery program. And unfortunately, the default for a lot of judges and people involved in the justice system is to give them 12 steps as an option, AA, NA. And AA works for a lot of people. It just doesn't work for everyone. And it is faith-based. One of the 12 steps is acknowledging a higher power. And obviously that doesn't work for everyone. And if you are only provided a faith-based option and you are mandated to attend by the state, that's a violation of your First Amendment rights. And we have a long-standing, there's tons and tons of cases where people have sued because they were denied a secular option, and every single time they have won their case. So this is really a well-established constitutional right. But the reason that we need this legislation is because the system hasn't changed, right? You can have an established right on paper, right? Abortion is a great example, right? We had Roe v. Wade, but does that mean that women everywhere in the country have easy access to abortion? No. So there are times when you can have this well-established right, but you still need legislation to really protect people. And right now, the burden is really on the defendant. If you are a defendant in this position, not only do you have to know that you have a right to a secular option, you have to have the resources and the courage, frankly, to advocate for yourself and say, I would like to not have to attend a faith-based option. I want another option. And most folks in this kind of situation where they're suffering from addiction, they're in the criminal justice system, the likelihood that they're going to have the resources and the know-how to advocate for themselves is very, very low. So you've got a lot of people that are just being sent to a 12-step program that may not work for them. And they may be essentially being coerced into a religious program by the state. And so really what this bill would do is it shifts that burden completely away from the defendant to the state. So what the bill would do is it would make sure that these courts that are letting the defendant know, hey, you have this option. This is your constitutional right. And the bill actually calls for them to have to sign something to acknowledge that they've been informed of that right, and then be provided with it. One last thing on this that's really important to understand is that 12-step programs, not only are they faith-based, but they're really tend not to be supportive of medication-assisted treatment. For those of you who aren't familiar, we know because of science that it is not actually possible for most people, especially if you're addicted to something like heroin, for example, to just go cold turkey through sheer willpower, right? We know what happens to the brain, and medication-assisted treatment helps people actually get through withdrawal symptoms, because the withdrawal symptoms can make people feel like they're dying, right? Like they get so sick from the withdrawal that they relapse, right? And so based on best practices, based on the science, we know that if we're going to make progress on our addiction crisis in this country, medication-assisted treatment, MAT, being widely accessible and not being stigmatized is incredibly important. Now, why is this related to this bill? Because if your only option in these cases is 12-step programs, which are going to tell you that doing MAT is wrong, that's a huge problem. Programs like Smart Recovery, Life Ring, Women for Sobriety that are secular, that are non-religious options, they are expressly supportive of medication-assisted treatment, because what happens in a 12-step program, you can go by day, get prescribed medication from your doctor, and then you go to your peer meeting at AA and you're told you're not clean, you're not doing the right thing, you can't talk in the meeting. Like, that actually happens to people. But we have excellent non-religious options that do the opposite and have a science-based and evidence-based approach to MAT. And so this is something that if we get this passed next year, and right now we're contacting our legislators on both Senate and Assembly side to ask them to co-sponsor the bill, we can really change people's lives. This small piece of the system has a huge impact on the life of individuals who really need the state to provide them with more options. Of course, the First Amendment aspect of this is making sure that the state of New York is never coercing someone to attend a faith-based program. And by the way, it's the first of its kind. So New York can really lead the rest of the country. Harvey Epstein, who is the assembly member who sponsored the bill on the House side, in the Assembly, he's going to be presenting in September to a group of legislators across the country about his bill in the hopes that others will introduce the same. So by getting involved, you are really kind of pioneering an issue that brings together both, church-state separation and science-based policy. So I really hope all of you are interested in one or both of these bills, because we really need people who are willing to email and meet virtually with legislators. I'm going to put my name in the chat now here, so please feel free to send me an email and say I'm in, and then I will get you set up to get involved in what we're doing. So to close here, I want to go back to what Paul was saying earlier, which is that there's all these issues that really are tie back to separation of church and state and Jewish values. And so to make the connection there, immigration and refugee rights, we may not immediately think of church-state separation, but when you think about things like the Muslim ban, right, that was a religious test that we were imposing on people entering the country. We know that a lot of the hatred and fear of refugees and immigrants is driven by white Christian nationalism and nativism. And you might remember years ago when the Attorney General Jeff Sessions, he quoted from the Bible to justify the family separation policy. And so there's absolutely an aspect of religion in these issues. Obviously, and Paul talked about this, reproductive rights and women's rights. We know that Christian nationalists are imposing a very specific, narrow Christian view of personhood on everybody else, including the Jewish community that has a very different perspective on those issues. Same thing with LGBTQ rights, which we talked about, this push to have taxpayer-funded discrimination and adoption and foster care, but also the ability to discriminate as a business or a nonprofit like Catholic Social Services that are providing social services on behalf of the government. Access to secular education, as we mentioned, and we're not just here in New York, but nationally, we've got a lot of states introducing these academic freedom bills or Bible class electives, where they're getting right at the line of what's constitutional by, for example, mandating that all schools offer an elective to study the Bible. So students may not be forced to take the class, but then you have to ask, what is really the purpose here? They're not pushing for Torah class electives or Quran class electives, right? And the last being climate change, or the climate crisis, I should say, it's really important that we stand up for science, and we know that there's a big crossover there of Christian nationalism and climate deniers there. So I'm way past my time, as Paul has let me know. So just wanted to recap there so that you have a sense of kind of why everything we're doing ties back to separation of church and state. I hope you guys will get involved, and I'll stop there and we'll go to Q&A.